The silver wedding band felt like a shackle as I turned it between my fingers. 25 years of loyalty reduced to ashes by lipstick that wasn't my shade. Some men break when betrayed. I hunt. My name is Jack Harmon. I am 53 years old, a wilderness guide who spent more time tracking animals than understanding people. The scar over my right eye, a reminder of a bear encounter 10 years back, has become my unwanted trademark among clients. I learned everything I know from my father in the Colorado backcountry, and I speak the language of the forest better than I do the language of the city. I first noticed something was off when Elaine started coming home with her hair smelling different. Not her usual high-end salon products, but something earthier, like sandalwood. 25 years of marriage teaches you the small details. I didn't say anything right away. In the woods, you observe first, react later. My dog Rex sensed it too. He used to greet Elaine at the door, but lately he just lifted his head when she entered, then settled back into his spot by the fireplace in our Aspen Ridge cabin. Animals know when something isn't right. Sarah noticed it during poker night when Elaine breezed through on her way out wearing a dress I'd never seen before. After Elaine left, Sarah set her cards down and cleared her throat. Jack, how long's Elaine been dressing like that for her book club? Sarah kept her eyes fixed on her cards, rearranging them unnecessarily. Like what? I took a swig of my beer, already knowing the answer. Like she's going somewhere other than Susan Miller's living room to discuss Jane Austen. Sarah had known me since we were kids tracking elk through Rocky Mountain National Park. She didn't sugarcoat things. Frank, my other poker buddy, suddenly became very interested in his chips. Fold, he mumbled. Later that night, while emptying Elaine's coat pockets before dry cleaning, a habit from when we first got married, I found a receipt from a place called the Inkwell. Poetry readings, small plates, craft cocktails. Not Elaine's usual scene. The receipt showed 2 gin martinis, 2 plates of something called deconstructed bruschetta, and a timestamp of 10:42 p.m. on a Tuesday when she'd told me she was at her sister's. At breakfast the next morning, I poured coffee into Elaine's cup, studying her manicured hands as she scrolled through her phone. Her wedding ring sparkled in the morning light streaming through our kitchen windows. How's your sister doing? I asked casually, sliding an egg onto her plate. Fine, she answered without looking up. And how was the deconstructed bruschetta at the Inkwell? I kept my voice even, the same tone I use when pointing out a mountain lion track to clients. Her fingers froze on the phone screen. Half a second of hesitation before she recovered. Oh, Jennifer wanted to try something new instead of just meeting at her place. She took a sip of coffee, eyes meeting mine over the rim. You know how she gets bored with routine. I nodded, scraping the pan. I didn't know Jennifer was into poetry. Elaine's smile tightened. It was background noise. We barely noticed it. That night, I called Sarah from my truck while parked outside the Outfitters where I get supplies for my guided trips. You were right, I said when she answered. Damn it, Jack. I'm sorry. Sarah's voice was quiet. What are you going to do? I watched a hawk circle overhead, patient and calculating. Same thing I'd do tracking any animal that doesn't want to be found. I'm going to follow the signs. The next day, I dug out Frank Dawson's number from my contacts. Frank had been a cop before opening his PI business. He charged a lot, but he was thorough and discreet. Just like when I'm tracking a wounded elk through dense forest, I needed to be methodical. This wasn't going to be a hasty confrontation. This was going to be a hunt. Frank Dawson's office smelled like coffee and cigarettes, though a sign on his desk claimed he'd quit 5 years ago. His blinds were half closed, casting prison bar shadows across the worn carpet. He didn't get up when I entered, just gestured to the chair across from him. Jack Harmon. Been a while. Frank's voice had the gravel of someone who'd seen too much. Still taking rich folks into the woods to show them how to not get eaten by bears. Still charging folks to take pictures of their spouses at motels. I countered, settling into the chair. He laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves. Touché. Speaking of which, your call wasn't exactly a social one, was it? I didn't waste time explaining. Frank didn't need the emotional details, just the facts. I gave him Elaine's routines, the receipt, the lies about her whereabouts. He nodded, taking notes in a small pad with handwriting so cramped it looked like code. The Inkwell, huh? Frank tapped his pen against the notepad. Artsy place. Lots of people who think they're the next Hemingway. He named his price. It was steep, but cheaper than divorce without evidence. I want photos, dates, names. Everything. I slid an envelope across his desk with half his fee in cash. You always were thorough, Jack. Frank pocketed the envelope without counting it. I'll call when I have something. The next morning, I had a scheduled trip with a teenager named Kyle. His parents had sent him to my wilderness program after he'd gotten caught shoplifting for the third time. These trips were part of my business, teaching troubled kids to survive in nature, hoping it would translate to better choices in civilization. Kyle kicked at pine cones as we hiked up to Falcon Ridge, his shoulders hunched beneath his new backpack. This is stupid, he muttered for the 5th time that hour. How's knowing which berries I can eat gonna keep me out of juvie? I stopped beside a fallen log covered in deer tracks. See these? I pointed to the impressions in the soft earth. What came through here? Probably last night. Moving slow, stopping to feed. Kyle glanced down, unimpressed. So if you were hungry, tracking him might keep you alive. I knelt, pointing to where the tracks continued. But notice how the stride changes here? Gets longer, more purposeful. Kyle squinted. It's running. It sensed something. Probably a mountain lion. I pointed to barely perceptible paw prints nearby. The deer spotted danger and bolted. Survived another day because it paid attention to the signs. The boy's eyes widened slightly. You can tell all that just from footprints? Tracks don't lie, Kyle. Neither do patterns. I stood, adjusting my pack. People are the same way. They leave tracks, evidence of their movements, their intentions. You just need to know how to read them. As we continued up the trail, I thought about Elaine's tracks, the late nights, the changing scents, the defensiveness. In nature and in marriage, the signs were always there if you were patient enough to see them. Frank called 3 days later. I was cleaning my hunting rifle when my phone buzzed. You free for coffee? Got something to show you. His voice gave nothing away. We met at a diner off the highway, far from anywhere Elaine might go. Frank slid a manila envelope across the table before I'd even ordered. Your wife's been at the inkwell every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 weeks. Frank stirred his coffee. Always meets the same guy. The photos inside showed Elaine entering the dimly lit bar, then sitting close to a thin man with dark, disheveled hair. He wore a black turtleneck that looked like a costume for someone playing a poet. In one photo, her hand rested on his forearm, her wedding ring clearly visible. His name's Marcus Reed, Frank continued as I flipped through the images. Fancies himself a poet. Published a book of what he calls urban despair poetry last year. Sells about 3 copies a month, according to the bookstore owner I talked to. What's his angle? I asked, studying a particularly clear shot of Marcus leaning in, whispering something in Elaine's ear. Hard to say. He's got a reputation for attaching himself to wealthy women. No criminal record, but several complaints from former girlfriends about borrowed money never returned. Frank slid another paper across the table. Here's his address and daily routine. Thought you might want it. I folded the paper without looking at it. Keep going. I need more. Frank nodded. Figured as much. I'll set up surveillance, maybe plant a bug or 2. Legal gray area, but... He shrugged. Your call. Do it. I tucked the envelope into my jacket. I want to know when they're meeting next. Later that night, I drove to the inkwell and sat in my truck across the street, watching patrons come and go. This was reconnaissance, learning the terrain before making any moves. A coyote doesn't charge into a prairie dog town. It watches, learns the pattern, identifies the weak points. I thought about confronting Elaine immediately, showing her the photos, demanding explanations. But that's what an amateur would do. My father taught me better than that. Jack, he used to say, the wilderness rewards patience. Rush in, and you'll go home empty-handed. So I would be patient. I would gather more evidence, understand the full scope of the betrayal. Then, like any good hunter, I would wait for the perfect moment to strike. 2 weeks passed. I compiled everything Frank sent me in a fireproof lockbox in my workshop, the same one where I keep my hunting permits and land deeds. Each photo, receipt, and transcript went into a labeled folder. Methodical. Organized. The same way I'd pack for a 10-day expedition. I called Alan Sherwood, my attorney. We'd gone to high school together, and he'd handled my father's estate after the cancer took him 5 years back. Jack, Alan greeted me, his office overlooking downtown Aspen. This isn't about another boundary dispute with the Forest Service, is it? I placed Frank's folder on his desk. Need to know my options. Alan's expression changed as he scanned the contents. Colorado's an equitable distribution state. How much of your business did Elaine help build? None. She hated the cabin, the mud, the clients. Called it my little hobby, even after it started paying more than her family's investments. Alan nodded. We can protect Aspen Ridge and your guiding business. Your father's foresight in how he transferred the cabin to you helps. He slid a checklist across the desk. Follow these steps. New accounts, inventory of assets, documented timeline. Don't move out. Don't change the locks. Don't threaten. I saw Susan Harrington at the supermarket the next day. She co-chaired the hospital fundraiser with Elaine. Jack, how wonderful to see you, she beamed. Are you coming to the gala Saturday? Elaine's been working so hard on it. Wouldn't miss it, I said, selecting a steak from the meat counter. Been hearing Elaine's been busy with lots of new interests lately. Yes, well, you know Elaine. Always expanding her horizons. Especially at the inkwell, I hear. I kept my tone casual. She mentioned meeting some interesting people there. A poet, I think. Susan's hand froze midway to a bunch of grapes. Oh, she didn't mention. I didn't realize you knew about the poetry readings. Elaine and I share everything, Susan. I smiled, adding the steak to my cart. Looking forward to Saturday. As I walked away, I could practically hear the society grapevine beginning to rustle. Frank sent over a new file that evening. Background on Marcus Reed. 39 years old. 3 collections of poetry published by Vanity Presses, an eviction last year, and a pattern of dating women at least a decade older than him. The most interesting document was a bank statement showing regular cash deposits following his meetings with Elaine. That night, Elaine's phone chimed with a message while we were in the kitchen. She quickly turned it face down, claiming she had a board meeting. 2 hours later, Frank sent me a photo of her car parked outside the inkwell, not the country club. Another lie, another track in the snow. Elaine's parents' anniversary dinner was 4 weeks away. That would be my moment, when all the players would be on the stage, when the impact would be most complete. The Summit Club Gala arrived on Saturday evening. I wore the suit Elaine had bought me 3 Christmases ago, the one she said made me look almost civilized. We drove separately. She'd gone early to oversee preparations, or so she claimed. The ballroom sparkled with crystal and wealth. I accepted a whiskey from a passing waiter, watching Elaine work the room. She was in her element here, elegant in a blue dress that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. When she saw me, her smile faltered for just a moment before her social mask slipped back into place. Jack, I didn't think you'd actually come. She air-kissed my cheek, careful not to leave lipstick. Wouldn't miss it. I sipped my drink. Your poet friend coming tonight? The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. I nodded towards Susan, who was watching us while pretending not to. You know, it's amazing how quickly news travels when someone mentions the word affair in this town. This isn't the place. No, it isn't. I set my glass down. The anniversary dinner at your parents' next month seems more appropriate. Your whole family will be there to celebrate commitment and loyalty. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my arm. Jack, whatever you think is happening. I know exactly what's happening. I gently removed her hand. And soon, everyone else will too. Frank called me the next morning with news. Your boy Marcus has quite the history. 3 different women in the last 5 years, all wealthy, all suddenly interested in funding his artistic endeavors. He paused. And get this, he's been making inquiries about Aspen Ridge's value. Asking a real estate buddy of mine about commercial development potential for wilderness properties. That right? I stared out my workshop window at the mountains. Keep digging. I made a call to Richard Harmon, Elaine's father, and suggested lunch. The old man had always viewed me with thinly veiled disdain, but he agreed. We met at his club, where the staff called him by name, and no one dared to look at my hiking boots under the table. You've never asked to meet like this, Richard said after ordering. What's this about? Your anniversary dinner. And your daughter's extracurricular activities. His eyes narrowed. Explain yourself. I slid an envelope across the table, not everything, just enough. Photos of Elaine and Marcus, financial records showing withdrawals from our joint account after their meetings. Richard's face hardened as he examined each item. Who else knows? Just us. For now. He studied me with new respect. What do you want? Your support at the dinner. When I make things public. The old man thought for a moment, then nodded once. The hunting alliance was sealed. As I drove back to Aspen Ridge, I called Sarah. It's time, I told her. I need you at the anniversary dinner. 3 days before the dinner, I hiked to my father's favorite ridge with Rex. In the silence of the mountains, I reviewed my plan once more. The evidence was organized, the players positioned, the timing set. Like my father taught me, a clean kill is a matter of preparation, son. Respect your prey enough to do it right. The night of Richard and Martha Harmon's 50th anniversary arrived with a spring snowfall that dusted the mountains white. I dressed with unusual care: charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, the silver tie clip my father gave me when I turned 21. Before leaving, I checked the contents of my leather portfolio once more. Photos, bank statements, text transcripts, all arranged in sequence. The weapon was loaded. Elaine had gone ahead to help with preparations, another convenient lie. According to Frank, she'd spent 2 hours at the inkwell with Marcus before heading to her parents' country club. I arrived precisely at 7, nodding to the valet as I handed over my keys. Sarah met me at the entrance, dressed in a simple black dress that stood out among the flashier outfits. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly as we entered. Never been more sure of anything. The weight of the portfolio felt right in my hand. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated the dining room where 60 of the Harmons' closest friends mingled. Elaine stood near her parents, champagne flute in hand, laughing at something her mother said. She froze when she saw me, her eyes darting to the portfolio, then back to my face. I approached Richard first, shaking his hand firmly. "Congratulations. 50 years is quite an achievement." His eyes were cold but determined. "Indeed it is, Jack. Commitment means something to our generation." Martha Harmon kissed my cheek. "Jack, wonderful you could join us. Though we rarely see you at these functions." "Special occasion," I replied. "Some things need to be witnessed by family." Elaine sidled up, her smile brittle. "Jack, there you are. Why don't we get you a drink?" "In a minute." I checked my watch. "Isn't the toast scheduled for now?" Richard cleared his throat and tapped his glass. The room quieted as he began speaking about marriage, loyalty, and the sanctity of vows. When he finished, he unexpectedly turned to me. "My son-in-law has asked to say a few words." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. I wasn't known for public speaking. I moved to the center of the room, setting my portfolio on a small table. "Thank you, Richard." "Martha." I looked around the room, making eye contact with people who had, for years, viewed me as the rough mountain man who'd somehow landed their friend's daughter. Marriage is built on trust, on honesty. My voice was steady, carrying to every corner of the hushed room. The Harmons have modeled that for 50 years. Unfortunately, not everyone values those principles. I opened the portfolio, removing the first photograph, Elaine and Marcus entering the inkwell. "This is Marcus Reed, a poet," Elaine tells me. I held up the photo. "For the past 3 months, my wife has been meeting him here. And here." Another photo. "And here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elaine stepped forward, face contorted. "Jack, stop this right now. I'm just getting started." I laid out bank statements next. $20,000 withdrawn from our joint account in the weeks since they met. Coincidentally, Marcus has deposited similar amounts. I looked directly at Elaine. "Tell me, does he write poetry about the women he cons, or is that just foreplay?" Richard stepped forward, his face stone. "Elaine, is this true?" Before she could answer, the door opened. Frank entered, escorting Marcus Reed, who looked confused until he saw the photographs on the table. His face drained of color. "Sorry to crash," I said to the stunned room. But I thought the poet should hear his work appreciated by a wider audience. 3 months later, I stood on the ridge behind my cabin, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Rex circled the perimeter, nose to the ground, tracking a rabbit that had passed through earlier. Below, Aspen Ridge spread out, my wilderness-touring business now expanded with 2 new cabins under construction. The divorce had been finalized with surprising speed, largely due to Richard Harmon's influence. Turned out the old man valued family honor above all else, including his daughter's feelings. The telephone rang inside. I let it go to voicemail, savoring the morning silence. When I finally went in for coffee, I hit play on the machine. "Jack, it's Sarah. Thought you'd want to know Marcus Reed was indicted yesterday for fraud. 3 counts. Apparently, you weren't his only project." She paused. "Call me when you get back from the ridge. I know that's where you are." I smiled, pouring coffee into my father's old mug. Sarah knew my habits too well. The local paper lay on the table, folded open to a small article about Elaine's departure from 3 charity boards. Her father had systematically dismantled her social standing while my lawyer dismantled our financial entanglements. She'd kept the Harmon estate. I wanted nothing from her family, but the prenup my father had insisted on protected everything that mattered to me. Frank had stopped by last week with a final report and a bottle of bourbon. "Didn't think you had it in you," he'd said, glass in hand, watching the sunset from my porch. "Cold precision like that. My father taught me patience," I'd replied. Said rushing a shot just wounds the animal. Well, you didn't just wound them. Frank had laughed. Clean kill. The phone rang again. This time I picked up. Finally answering your phone, Sarah said. I'm bringing lunch. That diner in town has venison stew today. You don't need to check on me. Who says I'm checking on you? Maybe I want the company. After hanging up, I walked the property line, checking the new foundation where the expanded outfitter's shop would stand. Business had doubled in the past quarter. Turns out a man whose wife publicly humiliated him became something of a legend among a certain type of client. Men who'd been through similar betrayals sought me out, not just for wilderness skills, but for something like mentorship. Last week, a banker from Denver had followed me up a difficult trail, panting with exertion. How'd you do it? He'd asked. Get through it without losing yourself? I'd pointed to a falcon circling overhead. See that bird? It doesn't waste energy on unnecessary movement. It watches, waits, then strikes once, decisively. Nature doesn't tolerate inefficiency. Sarah's truck pulled up as I finished inspecting the foundation. She carried a cooler with lunch and a folder under her arm. Brought the permits for the expansion, she said, setting everything on the picnic table. And news from town. Let me guess. Elaine's selling the estate. Sarah nodded. Moving to Chicago, apparently. Her father's cut her allowance to practically nothing. I unwrapped the stew container, the rich aroma rising in the cool mountain air. Not our concern anymore. Sarah studied me for a moment. No regrets. About the marriage or how it ended? Either. Both. I thought about Elaine, about the 25 years we'd shared before it all unraveled. Then I looked out at the mountains, at the business I'd built, at Rex sleeping contentedly in the sun. The wilderness taught me everything I need to know about survival, I said finally, including when to cut bait and move on. 1 year to the day after Elaine's parents' anniversary dinner, I stood on the same ridge where my father had taught me to track elk as a boy. The morning sun cut through the pines, casting long shadows across fresh snow. Rex bounded ahead, his breath clouding in the crisp air. My satellite phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't answer it, but these days I had a business to run. Harmon, I answered. Jack. It was Frank. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus Reed got 15 years for investment fraud. Turns out your wife wasn't his only target. Ex-wife, I corrected. Right. Well, the DA used your case as the cornerstone. 3 other women came forward after your little anniversary dinner performance. He chuckled. Oh, and that land deal he was trying to set up using your property? Would have cost you everything. Appreciate the update. I hung up, tucking the phone away. From my vantage point, I could see all 4 cabins of the expanded Aspen Ridge Wilderness Tours. The parking lot was full, a group of executives was scheduled for a leadership retreat, and I had 3 guides now handling the workload. The old Harmon property had sold last month. Word was the new owners had gutted the interior, too ostentatious for their taste. A flash of movement caught my eye, a bull elk stepping cautiously into a clearing below. He paused, testing the wind, ears alert for danger. I had no rifle today, just binoculars. Some things were better observed than conquered. The sound of boots crunching snow announced Sarah's approach before I saw her. She'd started joining me for these dawn hikes months ago. Neither of us had put a label on what was happening between us, but we'd known each other long enough that words seemed unnecessary. Board meeting at 9, she reminded me, her shoulder brushing against mine as she took into view. Sarah handled the business side of things now, her accounting background proving invaluable as we expanded. Plenty of time. I handed her the binoculars, pointing out the elk. Got a call from Richard Harmon yesterday, she said after a while. Elaine's back in town. Wanted to know if you'd object to her reaching out. And I told him you were busy. Very busy. For the rest of your life. Sarah's mouth curved into a smile. That worked for you. I nodded, watching the elk disappear back into the trees. More than works. Last week, I'd taken a group of veterans on a tracking exercise. One of them, a former Army Ranger with PTSD, had asked me how I'd found peace in the wilderness. Nature doesn't lie, I'd told him. Everything leaves tracks. Read them correctly, and you'll never be lost. As Sarah and I headed back toward the cabins, I thought about the tracks that had led me here, Elaine's betrayal, the clean break, the rebuilding. My father would have approved of how I'd handled it all. Not a wounded animal thrashing in pain, but a predator turning disadvantage to opportunity. The business bank account showed a balance that would have shocked the old Elaine. The wait list for my guided expeditions stretched 6 months out. The Harmon social circle that once barely tolerated me now sought my company, my expertise, many of them clients. You coming? Sarah called from ahead, Rex circling her impatiently. I took one last look at the mountains before turning to follow them home. They'd be there tomorrow. Some things, unlike people, never betrayed you.